Okay, so the next slide has some space for you to take some notes and get some definitions down. So what's the difference between open Scripture and closed Scripture? Open Scripture means that it's still being formed, that the process of canonization is ongoing. Closed Scripture means that the canonization is complete. The text has been canonized. So, this is an example of closed Scripture. Why? Because if somebody was to stand up at church one day and say, hey, we should put something new in the Bible, what's everybody going to do? Everybody's going to say, you can't do that. Reason being is the book is closed. In case you're curious, at the very end of the New Testament, it says so. Is that if anybody tries to add on or take away from the word, bad news. But for hundreds of years, the canon was open. Things were moving in, being evaluated. Some stayed, some were kicked out. It was a very, very fluid process. So now, which came first? The chicken or the egg? Just kidding. So now on the next slide, you'll see that light green arrow. So this is timeline, so to speak, to kind of put all of these different concepts in order. Now, please make a little note that this timeline is true for Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Okay? And we'll talk about that, why it's not true for Islam as we get a little bit deeper into this lecture. So, starts with myth, with the oral tradition, right? What's myth? Those stories, poems, songs, aphorisms, plays, all of that wonderful stuff during the oral tradition that were passed down by word of mouth. Then, you'll notice that little bubble before canonization says religion. So we have to ask the question, why does a religion come before the scripture of that religion? And you can pause to think about. That's a really, really cool question. Have you got it? Okay. That's right. Because in order to begin the canonization and have scripture, you have to have the tenets and the beliefs of that religion. So this is something that's really, really cool. A lot of people don't know. What is older? Is Christianity or the Bible older? Which is older? Christianity. Wow. Which is older? Buddhism or the teachings of the Buddha? Buddhism. Which is older? Hinduism or the Bhagavad Gita? Hinduism. Wow. Now, this is the part that's just so amazing about this whole process. But today, people give so much authority to Scripture, we have forgotten that the teachings of the religion are older than the Scripture of that religion. Because, the teachings, those early founders who are going through and, deciding what makes it in and what doesn't. Wow, that's a really, really cool thought. So, religion comes first. Then the canonization. What's the canonization? That's right. That long process of forming Scripture. Then we have Scripture. Then, but sometimes, but not always, we can get a creed. The word creed comes from the Latin word credo, which means I believe. Creeds are statements that can condense beliefs based upon a church's teaching. And Christianity and Islam both use a creed. And a lot of people, and Christians, are familiar with the Apostles' Creed. And how does it begin? I believe. And what it is, it's a summary statement. It takes all the teachings and it squeezes them down. Now, do you remember we talked about, before we got too deep into this slide, that this slide doesn't fit for Islam? Now, how would this slide be rearranged for Islam? How? That's right. It would have Scripture, and then it would have religion. And if you've ever got into a discussion of theological nature with a Muslim, this is a point that is really a trump card for Islam, is that there's no myth, right? There's none of that shaky ground where everything changes because of the oral tradition. It's rooted solid on Scripture, on the Holy Quran. Wow. So now, the next slide, let's talk a little bit, and we'll have to continue this into the next lecture, about reading Scripture. Now, a lot of people, when they read Scripture, they read it literally. So what does that mean? It means taking words in their usual or most basic sense without metaphor or allegory. So this is when we use denotation. And do you remember what denotation, the easy way to remember? That's right, the D in denotation stands for dictionary. Now, this presents an obstacle, a pitfall that a lot of people unknowingly fall into. And that's with denotation versus connotation. We should only read Scripture denotatively when it's meant to. Otherwise, we should read it connotatively. Why should we read it with connotation? Because remember that Scripture for Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity began as myth, right? There were no dictionaries back then. Words had connotative meaning. They didn't have denotative meaning until there were dictionaries. And does anybody want to guess when the first dictionary was written? It was written in the 1700s during the Enlightenment. Before that, words didn't have a dictionary meaning. Everything was metaphor and allegory and connotation and implied meaning. But then all of a sudden, we are nailed down and we read things literally, which were not. How can you read a myth literally when it's a story that's trying to explain something unexplainable? Wow. Now, there are parts of Scripture that we are meant to read literally, and those were the parts that were written down as such. For example, the letters of Paul. Perfect example. that we are meant to read those literally. Otherwise, it's all interpretation. And then, when we have interpretation, there's all those different meanings that we can get from Scripture. So that's the number one reason why we cannot read Scripture literally. The second is translation problems. And I just took a peek at the clock and realized that we're at the 10-minute mark, so we're to pick up with translation problems in the next lecture.